morning. It's good to see all of you today. If we haven't met before, my name is Colin. I'm the pastor here at Branches, and I'm just so overjoyed to be with you on this first week, this first Sunday of Advent, where we set some expectations, some excitement for us to welcome Jesus into our lives again on Christmas Day and on Christmas Eve. And so we're glad to take this journey with you during this Advent season. If this is one of your first times here in particular, we'd love if you would check in and let us know that you're here today. You can scan this QR code on the screen, or if you miss it or sometime during the service want to check in, you'll see two cards in the seat back in front of you. One says Connect, and it has a QR code on the back that you can then check in that way. Or if you have been here for a while, you're looking to take your next step, be part of some group, or to grow in some way in some class or something else like that, or events coming up, you can scan the QR code on the back of the card that says Next Steps and let us know how you'd like to be connected to what's going on here at Branches. But again, I just want to welcome you here to this place. Again, it's so good to see you. We're starting a new series for Advent called Icons. When you hear the word icon, all sorts of things come to mind. If you're a computer person, you think about the icons that you click, or if you grew up maybe in a more Orthodox or Catholic adjacent tradition, maybe icons were a part of your religious observance, these beautifully painted and created images of people from the Bible or saints of the past. And there's a lot of kind of contemporary resurgence of icons in the Christian world, where you kind of use this picture of a person and their character as a channel. I got to be frank, when I hear the word icons, I think of Heads Up, the iPhone game you play, and we just came out of Thanksgiving, so maybe some of you played it with your family. And one of the categories in that game is icons, legends, and stars. And it's like a list, a collection of people who are like really emblematic, iconic, I guess we would say, in their field. They are successful in the arts, or they are celebrities, or they're really famous or infamous even. And they stand before us as icons. The word icon means to represent, a representative body, a representative person, a person who embodies a quality or a story or an idea or some sort of virtue. And that person then is a stand-in for that thing. And so over the next several weeks, as we make our way to Christmas Eve, we're going to talk about some icons in the Bible. Some people that stand out for a specific or a collection of qualities, and are like, we could point to that person and say they're iconic in that way, or they're representative of that idea, or they're representative of that virtue. And then, spoiler for Christmas Eve, we're going to say all of that kind of culminates in the icon of Jesus. A lot of theologians have said that Jesus is the icon of God, that Jesus is the perfect image, the specific image, the total perfected image of God in the world. Jesus is God's icon. So when we look at Jesus, we're looking face to face at God. And so that's what we're talking about over the next several weeks. When you think of the word icons, let's get a little participatory for a second. When you think of the word icon, who are some people that come to mind? And you, please, again, participate. But what are some names that come to mind? David. Mary, cool. Some non-Bible ones too. Michael Jordan, yes. I mean, literally iconic on shoes. What are some other ones? Yes, Taylor Swift. I think that one probably would come up, and I heard some other ones out there. So we can all think of the people that come to mind for us who are icons that represent an idea, or represent some sort of thinking, or represent for us some, piece of merchandise or something else. When I was thinking about this series, and in the past couple of weeks thinking about this idea of what it means to be an icon, and the people for us that we set before us that are icons, one of the qualities that came to mind for me for icons was resilience. People who faced a lot of adversity or obstacles, a lot of heartache. People who, when they got knocked down, they got back up again, Chumbawamba. They faced some sort of hardship, and then they found it within themselves to get back up and to try again. Like Harvard Business Review and Barna and some of these other studies that have been done on people who would be considered materially successful find that one of the best qualities of these people, one of the most common qualities, common thread among people that we would consider successful, are people who are resilient, who didn't have stories that were easy, who didn't have stories where like they just made it and it was luck and they had no obstacles, no adversity at all, but people who faced a lot of adversity, who had a lot of hardship, who went through a lot of pain and strife, and came out on the other side, were able to find within themselves the ability to stand up again, to work again, to try again. Resilience. Of course, for me, as it often happens when I think about resilience, And when I think about a number of other qualities too, I think about Brene Brown, because she teaches us about our shame and our kind of deeply held beliefs about ourselves and our kind of inner critic and maybe the shame statements and the impurities, imperfections we see in ourselves and how those things then become gifts. And she talks about resilience. And not just objectively from her studies and objectively from her being a researcher, but from her own experience. If you don't know Brene's story, and Brene, again, if you're watching, hi, good to see you today. Thanks for watching online. One day, you know. Yes, thank you, Michelle. We love you. My friend David, his staff at his church, they all refer to her as Saint Brene because he quotes her so often. She was not famous at first. Of course, like anybody who's famous now, they weren't famous before, but she was a researcher and she did a lot of research on shame. And her career kind of took off and she became kind of famous and became this sort of icon in the world today because of this TED Talk she gave. And it wasn't even at one of the main TED Talk events. It was kind of one of these TEDx minor events in the regional body of the TED organization. And she did this talk about shame and how we deal with our shame, how we overcome our shame, and all the research she had done on why we feel shame and what it does to us. So they posted this TED Talk online and it took off. And it became viral. Millions of people watched it. It kind of lifted her up. People were wondering, who is this Brene Brown person? And rightfully, wisely, her peers and her husband and her other family members and other people who knew her said, whatever you do not read the comment section. So what did Brene do? She read the comments, of course, you know. She went and she read all the comments and just like awful stuff. Like, I'd feel shame too if I were her. Or things about her appearance, or things about the way that she talked, just like ugly, nasty. I mean, it's the internet. So like, we've all been there. And when we're told not to read the comment section, I don't know about you, and I'm gonna read the comments. You know, that's where the fun stuff happens. And so she wallowed in her shame in response to a talk about shame for a couple of days. And then kind of came out on the other side and, you know, kind of get to where we are now with her and what she's taught so many of us is it's not the critic who counts. We talked about this with our quality of daring. It's not the critic who counts, but the one who's in the arena has mud and dirt and blood on their face because they've been trying and because they've been out there. She put herself in the arena. She's resilient. And because of her resilience, now she's so widely known and so many people have latched onto her story and what she's taught us about our shame. I think about a personal favorite of mine, Stephen King. Really probably considered the most successful American author of all time. Love him or hate him, if he's your thing or if he's not your thing, whatever, you got to admit he's big, he's huge. Everybody knows who Stephen King is. Faced alcoholism in his young adulthood and overcame that. Faced rejection over and over and over again, which seems to be the story of a lot of successful authors. Send manuscripts to tons of publishers, never receive any sort of attention, get a ton of rejection letters, a stack thicker than the manuscript they sent, you know? And finally, after he threw away the manuscript for Carrie, which was then to be his breakout hit, and his wife Tabitha encouraged him and pulled it out of the trash can and sent it away to be published, he was a published author. And then later in his career, after he was already famous and many of his books had been adapted into movies and other things, he was hit by a minivan while he was on a walk and nearly died. And it became incredibly painful for him to sit for long periods of time and write his livelihood, his whole life, what he loved to do, his passion. And he's come out on the other side and still is like cranking out like 2 books a year, it seems like. And he's like always on the Today Show talking about some wacky, weird thing he's come up with. He's resilient. And it's kind of a credit to his success. He was able to get knocked down and get back up again. That's what resilience is. Or when I was reading about resilience this past week, one that just kind of struck me that I did not know the story of was Colonel Sanders. That Colonel Sanders, who tried to break out in not just the restaurant business and the food business, but in tons of other sort of business ventures and failed, and no one would give him the time of day. In fact, he tried to, have a chicken restaurant and it was shut down. He had to shut it down personally because they were going to build a highway right through the location where his restaurant was, sending him almost on the brink of bankruptcy and total financial personal destruction. And then he started to sell out his recipe and to franchise what became KFC at the ripe young age of 62. That's resilience. And so this past week, I've been thinking about these icons, these people in our life, and just like over and over, the people that we've all described. I mean, Taylor Swift is a good example, or someone said King David, or even Michael Jordan, who we all have these like storied understandings of their life, faced a lot of adversity and obstacles, and then were resilient and came out on the other side. And so we're talking today about a person that I think in the Bible really shows an incredible amount of adversity, and it's Abraham. One of the first kind of main human characters of the Bible. And this is Paul, the apostle, centuries later, using Abraham as an example of faith and what Abraham's life was, what it was an emblem of, what it was an icon of for people now who are following Jesus. So we're in Romans chapter 4, starting in verse 1. We're going to read the first 8 verses. It says this, and if you need a Bible ever at Branches, there's Bibles back here by the sound booth. You're welcome to go grab one and take it home with you if you'd like. We're in Romans chapter 4, starting in verse 1. It says this, what then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. But to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness. So also David speaks of the blessedness of those to whom God reckons righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose iniquities are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whom the Lord will not reckon sin. Friends, this is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. I saw, Andrea's right there. Hi, Andrea. Calling out Andrea. She's waving her hands. We went through the book of Genesis not that long ago, and we read Abraham's story. And he's not a perfect person, Andrea can attest, and anybody else who's read Genesis before, but you can't say about Abraham that he was what we call now a Nepo baby. That he grew up in a family that like he had a leg up, that everybody loved him, that he did a great job, that he didn't face any adversity in his efforts to become who he thought God was calling him to be. God called him to leave his homeland, which in context of Genesis, and also in the people who wrote and compiled Genesis, looking back, that was actually a step down for him. Because what was important to him and his contemporaries was to have longevity, was to leave a legacy, was to be important, was to build something and grow something, a family, a community, something where he was from, and to be known for it. And God asked him to leave that. And God asked Abraham well into his late adulthood to pursue bearing children. And even with Abraham's resistance, God is like, no, I'm going to do this for you. And he faced that adversary, faced that obstacle, because over and over again it wasn't happening. And so then he tried it with someone else, to put it in a light Advent churchy way. And that was successful, if you can say that, and then was eventually estranged from that woman and that son, his first son. And then not that long ago, we talked about this story in Abraham's life where God asked him to give up his very son, Isaac, and face that adversity. And then his hand was stayed from actually giving that sacrifice. And God said, now I know that you trust me. If we look at Abraham's life over and over again, if you read Genesis and trace Abraham's life, and not only that, if you search for Abraham's name in the New Testament and see how people talk about Abraham over and over again, it's his faith, his faithfulness, his trust in God. And not light trust, like, folks on the internet say, like, faith is just believing things without evidence. It was actually not the biblical definition of faith at all. Abraham, the way he defined faith in his own life is he had good reason to believe that God would stick with him. Because God, over the course of time, would continue to surprise him in his life, and Abraham would say, like, okay, God, you're nuts, but I'll stick with you. Okay, God, I don't actually really believe you in this moment, but I'm going to do what you say. I'm going to hold on to you. I'm going to hold on tight, and I'm going to expect the outcome is going to be good because you say it's going to be good. You say I'm going to have innumerable children, and I wish they had included in this the Bible. And then cheesy Christian youth groups will sing it for centuries long after you're gone, Father Abraham had many sons and daughters. I am one of them, so are you. Let's all praise the Lord, right arm, left arm, etc. That it seemed impossible for him and his wife and the rest of his family and the rest of the people in his community that he would build this great nation through this old man. And yet Abraham trusted. Abraham was resilient because he trusted God. Abraham's resilience didn't come from like a try-hard attitude, like, I'm Abraham, I can do this. Look at me, I'm Abraham, I can really do this. I'm just gonna try really hard, I'm gonna put forth a lot of effort, and then things are gonna work out. Abraham's frailty lent to his trust of God, which then lent to his resilience. Abraham trusted God and therefore was resilient, rooted in a life of godliness, rooted in a life of transformation. And then as Paul points out here in Romans, rooted then in a life of righteousness that wasn't his own. He trusted God, and so God accounted that trust as righteousness. God transformed Abraham's life, and Abraham trusted God because of it. There's this really great story. Elizabeth Elliot, she's a Christian author, and if you don't know Elizabeth Elliot's story, it's really remarkable. She and her husband were missionaries, and her husband went to a tribe in Ecuador to share with them the story about Jesus and was killed by them. And then Elizabeth Elliot spent several years after that trying to reach the people that had killed her husband. She faced adversity. She was no slouch. She was not a weak-willed or weak-minded or weak person by any stretch of the imagination. But she trusted God. And she tells a story that she went to Wales and was kind of following around a shepherd and the sheep. And she watched, and some other people were there too, she watched as these shepherds, these dogs, these shepherd dogs, were nipping at the heels of these sheep and kind of trying to get them together, and the fear and the look of the sheep faces as they were trying to guide them to this building. And they're kind of getting them all together. The dogs are barking and kind of, putting them in this direction through fear in some way, through adversity, nipping at their heels. And once they got the sheep in there, the shepherd, the man, would grab the ram by the horns and put it into this vat of antiseptic fluid and like dunk them under it. And they're like, wailing, and it's, their head under there, like getting it all over them, without which though they would die from infection. Die from whatever things would be out in the field in Wales. And someone said behind Elizabeth Elliot, this is the way the story goes, what would it be like to be one of these sheep and think that the shepherd, this person that you trusted, that you cared for, that gave you a place to live and gave you food to eat, what would it be like to think that your shepherd was trying to kill you? And Elizabeth Elliot said, I think I know. I think I know that feeling. And that story, I think, is so helpful in understanding, because I think Abraham knew that well too. He was asked by God to leave his livelihood, leave his home, to pursue childbearing, pursue building this community long after it seemed possible. To even this daring, I think, really awful, terrible story of God asking Abraham to give up his line in a patrilineal society, a society that he would pass on who he was to his son, to ask him to give that up in trust of God. To be dunked again over and over and over again into this antiseptic, and to think like, this feels like you're trying to hurt me, but I trust you. This feels like not what I would do for myself, but I trust you. My stories in my own life of resilience are insignificant compared to Abraham's and compared to Elizabeth Elliot's and compared to any of the other people we've listed today, even compared to Colonel Sanders. But I learned a little bit about resilience yesterday morning. It's called 1 year old on an airplane. My wife, she's the resilient one. I'm the, oh no, is this ever going to end one, But I have to say, Roscoe's a little angel. 80% of the flight was fine. Where my resilience was tested was actually not by him, but was by the woman sitting in front of Landon and Roscoe, who I guess her private plane must not have been working that day, because she was very troubled by, a baby making noise or, God forbid, moving. And I could feel myself like, am I going to have to fight this woman in an airplane today? Like dropped something down in the seat back in front of us. Roscoe's reaching for it. She turns and glares at me. I'm like, sorry, we dropped something, It is the Saturday after Thanksgiving. There are other people in the world, But I thought in that moment, I was thinking like, I'm going to preach tomorrow. Got to be a godly, kind person or whatever. I got to be a godly, kind person. Like, that's the goal. You trust in the moment. Corey ten Boom talks about this. If you're on a train and it goes through the tunnel, you don't think like, oh, it's going to be dark forever and we're never going to get out of the tunnel. You see the light at the end of the tunnel. For me, it's the little animated plane on the screen in front of me getting closer to Houston. But you trust. John Wesley, an icon of mine, said that trust is the definition of faith, is simple trust. And trust is given, one, by our risk in it, is two, given by our evidence that we could trust another person, and we're testing our trust in our relationships at every moment, in our coworkers' relationships at every moment, in our marriages, the churches that we go to, the communities that we're part of. Our test is trust, and we're given evidence for it. And our ability to trust in those things breeds in us resilience to do the next thing. This is a great book. If you've not looked at it, it's more of like a reference book. It's called Atlas of the Heart. Again, Brene. Yes, let's go, Atlas of the Heart. This is my wife's copy. She's entrusted me with it. And she talks about all the different sorts of emotions. I kind of want to read to you the beginning of just the kind of chapter listings. Like it's all these emotions, all these kind of feelings, dispositions we have to the world. Like some of the headings are the places we go when things are uncertain or too much, stress or vulnerability or worry. Places we go when we compare, reverence, envy, jealousy. Places we go when it's beyond us, curiosity, confusion. Places we go when things aren't what they seem, amusement, bittersweetness, nostalgia, etc. And she has a passage in here about trust. She quotes Charles Feltman, who defines trust as choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. We trust in risk that the trust will be broken. We trust even when it's tenuous and we don't quite feel like it's going to work out the way we think it could work out, the dream that we've been given. We trust, we deposit, we hitch our wagon to something even when we feel like we can't see the other side. Advent is the season, and Abraham is the emblem for us, the icon for us of a person who very well had every reason to not trust God, but trusted. To not hitch his wagon to God, but hitched his wagon. To not give himself to the vision, to the dream that God had given him, but gave himself to it. I say this as a person who, just so you know, is initially distrustful. And is a growing edge for me. And it probably is a growing edge for many of us. We live in a distrustful age. And I think for a lot of good reasons. But what God is calling us to, and like people with Abraham or with David or Ruth or Naomi or these other people we're going to talk about over the next several weeks, and Mary in particular, is a radical trust of God that says, I don't see the other side, but you do. I don't know how it's going to end up, but you do. I may not fully understand it, but in you, embodied in this person, Jesus, we have a glimpse, we have a perfect image of the way you want the world to be and the way you want us to be. That trust in who God is, and especially in who God is in Jesus Christ, will breed in you, God promises, resilience for the next moment, for the next day, for the next week, for the next year. And I invite you to pray with me, that God will instill in us that trust, that we can be a resilient community together. Thanks be to God for that.